We lived only to save these people, and wondered what would become of them. Odette Rigault, a young Frenchwoman of Graignes, Normandy, speaking years after the war about the strangers who fell from the sky into her village. This was not a story about soldiers landing where they were supposed to land. It was a story about a debt paid twice, once by men who chose not to run, once by villagers who chose not to talk. You will not find this in the textbooks, not in the documentaries about the beaches, not in the films about the hedgerows. And yet the question it raises deserves an answer. How did fewer than 200 men, scattered by accident 18 miles from where they were meant to land, hold off an entire regiment of one of the most feared divisions in the German order of battle? Inside a village no strategist had ever marked as worth dying for. The record of what happened survives mostly in enemy casualty reports, an official investigation that arrived too late, and the memory of villagers who never wore a uniform. That is where this story lives, not in myth-making, but in the paperwork nobody thought to hide. We will come back to that question. First, the sky, and the mistake that put these men where no plan had ever intended them to be. June 6, 1944, 2:38 in the morning. 12 C-47 transport planes carry the 3rd Battalion, 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne Division, toward Drop Zone T, near the village of Amfreville. Flak fills the air over the Cotentin coast. Pilots bank, climb, scatter. The green light comes on over the wrong ground. 12 plan loads of American paratroopers fall instead into the flooded marshland around a small parish called Graignes, 18 miles off course. The worst misdrop of any American airborne unit on D-Day. Some men come down in trees. Some come down in open pasture within sight of German positions. A few never come down safely at all, swallowed by chest-deep water before they can cut free of a parachute suddenly turned from a lifeline into an anchor. The Germans had flooded these marshes months earlier, deliberately, anticipating exactly this kind of landing, a static, low-cost defense that needed no extra soldier to man it. On the night of June 6th, it very nearly does the work the German army could not otherwise spare the men to do. Men drown in the swamp under the weight of their own equipment before they fire a single shot. Others cut themselves free of their harnesses and water up to their chests, in darkness, in a country whose language most of them do not speak. By 10 that morning, Captain Leroy D. Brummett has gathered roughly 25 men and led them into the village itself. A Waco glider crashes nearby that afternoon. Stragglers keep arriving through the day and the next. By June 7th, the count stands at 182 American paratroopers, most from the 5007th, a handful from Company B, 501 1st, 501st, 501st and 1st and 171 who soldiers from an anti-aircraft battalion, 2 glider pilots who never expected to fight as infantry. Major Charles D. Johnston takes command. He faces a choice that is barely a choice. Push toward the original objective, alone, through country crawling with German patrols, or dig in, at Graignes, and wait for the seaborne forces to fight their way inland. It is a decision made without higher authority to approve it, without a radio link to explain it, and without any guarantee that anyone beyond the marsh will ever learn it was made at all. He chooses to dig in. It is, on paper, an absurd decision. Graignes is a village of just over 200 scattered farmhouses, a 12th century church, a scattering of muddy roads threading through marsh and hedgerow. It commands no bridge, no crossroads of any strategic weight that the maps of either army had circled in red. Nothing here suggests it will matter to the outcome of a war. To the north sits Carentan, the actual objective on every operational map, the town that has to fall for the Utah and Omaha beachheads to link into a single Allied line. Nobody in Graignes commands that town. Nobody in Graignes will even see it during the fighting. That will not stop this village from deciding its fate. Nothing, except the men who decide to hold it, and the people who decide to help them. If a story like this one moves you, men and civilians who chose to stand rather than vanish quietly into occupied countryside, that is exactly the kind of history this channel, Sam WW2, exists to preserve. No pressure, no spectacle, just a request. If this is worth remembering, like it, subscribe, and send it to someone who still believes courage in this war belonged only to the beaches. Now back to Graignes. By June 1944, Normandy had lived under German occupation for 4 years. Curfews, requisitions, informers. The machinery of control was not new to anyone in Graignes. What was new was the choice suddenly placed in front of them: stay uninvolved, or take a side while the outcome was still very much in doubt. The mayor, Alphonse Voydie, meets with Johnston within hours of the paratroopers' arrival. He organizes the village's response before the Americans have finished counting their own dead in the marsh. Germaine Boursier, who runs the local cafe and grocery, sets up a rotation of village women cooking around the clock. 2 hot meals a day for nearly 200 foreign soldiers, out of a village that has little enough to feed itself. Staff Sergeant René Rabe would recall the boiled cabbage with melting butter as the best meal of his life. Not because it was fine cooking, because of who made it and why. Under German occupation policy, sheltering an Allied soldier was, by itself, sufficient grounds for execution. No trial required, no appeal available. Every villager who opened a door to a paratrooper that week already knew the price of being wrong. 2 sisters, Odette and Marthe Rigault, take a boat out into the flooded marsh to retrieve equipment the Americans cannot reach on foot: mortars, machine guns, ammunition, sunk in reeds and mud where the men had jettisoned it to swim. 15-year-old Joseph Folliot ferries men and supplies by boat under a sky that could bring German aircraft at any moment. Marthe, 12 years old, would remember it 70 years on in 5 words. "We were all so afraid once more." Her grandfather warns her plainly before she goes out on the water. "We will all be shot." He is not exaggerating. He is right. One habit takes hold among the paratroopers in those first days, pooling what tobacco survived the jump into a single shared ration. Sergeant Frank Costa would later describe watching 11 men take one long drag each, holding the smoke in, reluctant to let it go, like men taking a last breath and trying to make it last. It becomes a small, recurring ritual. It will not be the last time these men share out something precious in careful portions. None of these villagers wear a uniform. None of them signed anything obligating them to risk their lives for men they had known for a matter of hours. They do it anyway. That fact will matter later. Remember it. By June 9th, the defense is organized. 2 81mm mortars recovered from the marsh are dug in. 4 Browning .3 caliber machine guns cover the approaches. A detachment climbs into the belfry of the 12th century church, a building older than the country that built the weapons now aimed at it, to serve as an observation post. From there, a man can see every road and cattle track leading into Graignes from the west and the southwest. It is, by accident, one of the finest defensive positions in the Cotentin. The parish priest, Abbé Albert Le Blastier, does not object to soldiers climbing his bell tower to watch for the enemy, a decision that will cost him everything. We will come back to him. Nobody in the village calls what is coming inevitable. Nobody has to. The Germans will come. It is only a matter of when and how many. The night before the first patrol arrives, the village goes quiet in a specific way, not peaceful, watchful. Sentries change without a word. Villagers keep their lamps low. In the church, what is left of the medical kit is laid out and recounted for the 3rd time that day, as if counting it again might make more of it appear. June 10th, afternoon. The first German patrol probes the outskirts of the village. It is turned back, but it confirms what everyone already suspected. The Americans have been found. The defenders count what they have. Mortar rounds, limited, and none coming. Machine gun belts. Enough for a day of heavy fighting, not 2. Medical supplies, a single aid station, a single battalion surgeon, Captain Abraham Bud Sofian, and 2 medics, for whatever wounded the next assault produces. Reinforcements, none. No relief column is coming up that road. Nobody outside Graignes even knows, with any precision, that these men are here. There is even, in the waiting, a flash of dark humor. Technician 4th grade Eddie Page would later put it plainly. It's a good thing the Germans gold brick sometimes, just like we do. Even an army feared across Normandy has men who drag their feet before an assault. That too buys time. June 11th, 10:20 in the morning. The first major assault arrives. German infantry push toward the church from the surrounding fields. The Americans let them close, then open up with everything they have. The line holds. The attackers pull back, leaving dead in the grass. From the belfry, the mortar teams get exactly what they were promised. A clear line on every approach. Rounds walk in ahead of the German advance with a precision that has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a week spent ranging distances to fence posts, hedgerows, and the bend in the road nobody else had bothered to measure. Wave 1. Broken. A pause. Not peace. A reloading of the machine that is about to try again. 2 in the afternoon. The second wave. Heavier this time. Closer. The Germans have stopped testing and started committing. This time it is not only infantry. Mortars first, walking fire across the village. Then the sound that changes everything. The flat, tearing crack of 88mm guns fired from the high ground above nearby Lithewville, a battery that can punch through anything the paratroopers have and answer nothing they can throw back. The shells find the belfry. The observation post that had watched every road into the village comes down in stone and timber. First Lieutenant Elmer F. Farnham dies there, at his post, watching the roads he had been watching all week. A church bell that will never ring again. Minutes later, a shell finds the command post. First Lieutenant Lowell C. Maxwell is killed where he stands. Wave 2. Costlier than the first on both sides. The defenders keep firing. What else is there to do? By evening, the numbers tell their own story. Roughly 2,000 men of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen, an armored infantry division, one of the most battle-hardened formations Hitler still has in Normandy, are pressed against a defensive line manned, at its peak, by fewer than 200, 10-1. Then worse, as the American dead and wounded mount and the line thins from the inside. By nightfall, the defenders are counting rounds, not belts, individual cartridges passed hand to hand, rationed like the last of anything scarce. Wave 3 does not break. It simply does not stop. The village is burning in patches now. Smoke over the marsh. The church tower, gone. The command structure in pieces. Major Johnston is lost in the collapse of the position. Some accounts say wounded, overrun and killed before the day is out. The record here is not clean, and honesty requires saying so. Captain Brummett takes command of what is left, and gives the order that saves the most lives left to save. Break contact. Get out. Not everyone can go together. Not everyone can go at all. Fragments now, because that is what the fighting becomes. A machine gun, firing until the barrel glows. Men crawling through hedgerows in the dark. A wounded man carried, not left. A boat, pulled silently through reeds by hands that are not a soldier's hands. A password, whispered wrong, corrected just in time. A door, opened by a farmer's wife, for men she has never met and will likely never see again. The marsh, again, the same water that had swallowed men 5 days earlier now hides the ones still breathing. No parade, no bugle, just movement and silence, and the terrible arithmetic of who makes it and who does not. Somewhere in that retreat, a half-empty tin of tobacco changes hands one more time, between two men who may not make it to morning. Small portions, careful hands. The last ritual before the village falls. The village falls that evening. What happens next is not combat, it has a different name. German troops reach the church, where Captain Sofian and his 2 medics are still tending 14 wounded paratroopers who could not be moved. SS soldiers line the captain, the medics, and the wounded against a wall. 5 of the wounded are bayoneted. Their bodies are thrown into a nearby pond. 9 more are marched roughly 4 kilometers south, to a field near Le Mesnil-Angot. 4 kilometers is roughly an hour's walk for a man carrying nothing. These men carry wounds, and the shovels their guards hand them at the end of it. They are made to dig their own graves. Then they are shot, one by one, through the head, and pushed into the pits they had just finished digging. Captain Sofian and his 2 medics are shot as well. Sofian's body will not be recovered until the spring of 1945. 17 men. Executed, not killed in the fighting, killed after it, in cold procedure, by soldiers who had lost the battle for the village and decided to win something else instead. The village pays too. 44 residents of Graignes are rounded up, questioned as suspected collaborators, and shot. 2 priests, Abbé Albert Leblastier and Father Louis Le Barbenchon, are dragged from the rectory into the courtyard and shot where they stand. 2 women, Madeleine Pézeril and 80-year-old Eugénie Dujardin, are shot in their own beds. Not one villager, under interrogation, gives up the names of those hiding paratroopers in barns and cellars across the parish. Not one. On June 13th, the Germans burn what is left. They pour gasoline over the bodies of the 2 priests and the 2 murdered women and set them alight. The fire is allowed to spread unchecked. 66 homes are destroyed outright. The boys' school, Madame Boursier's cafe, the same kitchen that had fed 2 hot meals a day to men who were, by any military logic, already dead men walking. The 12th century church, the one whose belfry had watched the roads, does not survive. The church that had stood for 8 centuries, the one described days earlier, is older than the country now burning it down. 159 more buildings are damaged by fire or by the fighting itself. Before June 11th, Graignes had consisted of just over 200 houses and outbuildings. Afterward, 2 remained untouched. 2. What did this cost the attackers? German after-action estimates from the fighting on June 10th and 11th list roughly 500 killed and 700 wounded. figures drawn from Wehrmacht reporting rather than an independent post-war count, and worth stating with that caveat attached rather than as settled fact. Even taken cautiously, the ratio is difficult to process. A defending force of under 200 men, most of them accidental defenders who had never intended to fight there at all, inflicted losses on a full SS regiment running into the hundreds before that regiment ever finished clearing the ground. No triumph in that number, no parade math, just proof, written into the enemy's own casualty reports, of what those 2 days actually cost. Of the 182 Americans who had gathered in Graignes, 32 died, the 17 executed among them, the rest killed in the fighting itself. More than 100 reached Allied lines eventually, most of them owing their lives to villagers who fed them, hid them, and rode them out through marshland under threat of exactly the kind of reprisal that had just been carried out on their neighbors. 21 paratroopers alone had been sheltered in the Rigault family's barn. On June 15th at 10 in the morning, that group finally set out from the Rigault farm, working south toward American lines, weeks after most histories of D-Day had already moved on to other names, other beaches, other headlines, and Graignes had bought something with its dead. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, tied down for 2 critical days trying to clear a village that should have taken an afternoon, arrived late and understrength for its intended role in the German counterattack toward Carentan. 2 days later, at the Battle of Bloody Gulch, that counterattack was thrown back, and Carentan, the actual strategic prize, the town every general's map did circle in red, stayed in American hands. Historians who have studied the timeline since are cautious about giving Graignes sole credit for saving Carentan. Battles rarely turn on a single delay, but they agree that the 2 days lost at Graignes were 2 days the German counterattack never got back. A village nobody had marked as important, held on long enough to make the village that mattered defensible. That is the arithmetic history rarely bothers to run. The men who survived carried Graignes with them, quietly, for decades. Captain Brummett lived to see his surviving paratroopers help in the later fighting for Carentan itself. First Lieutenant Frank Naughton survived the retreat through the marsh and did not return to Graignes until 1984, 40 years later, when he and fellow officer Lieutenant Pip Reed came back to find the Rigault sisters, the 2 young women who had once poled a boat through reeds to save strangers, and to thank them, at last, in person. Captain Sofian's remains, recovered in the spring of 1945, were finally laid to rest, nearly a year after his body was pushed into the ground beside the men he had refused to abandon. The village itself was not liberated until July 10, 1944, more than a month after the massacre, by the American 1113th Cavalry Group. It rebuilt slowly, in isolation, the way villages do when the world has moved on to easier stories. Justice, such as it was, arrived even more slowly and incomplete. A United States Army investigation into the massacre opened in 1947. By then, records had scattered, witnesses had dispersed, units had been dissolved and reassigned across a defeated Germany, being rebuilt into something else entirely. No member of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was ever charged for what happened at Graignes. Not one. By 1947, American occupation authorities were already shifting resources toward the emerging Cold War, rather than exhaustive war crimes accounting for every village-level massacre in a defeated Germany being rebuilt as an ally. Graignes was one case among thousands competing for attention that was not there to give. Why has this story stayed in the shadows for so long? Partly geography, a marshland parish, far from the beaches that photographers and newsreel cameras reached first. Partly timing, overshadowed within days by the larger battle for Carentan, which absorbed the headlines the delaying action at Graignes had helped make possible. Partly the simple cruelty of archives. The men executed at Le Mesnil-Angot could not tell their own story, and for years the villagers who could had no audience willing to listen past the ruins of their own homes. No embedded photographer walked into Graignes with the paratroopers. No newsreel crew followed the assault. The battles that shaped popular memory of D-Day are, disproportionately, the battles someone happened to be filming. Other paratrooper stands from that same week became famous. A bridge, a manor house, a causeway. Graignes became a paragraph, when it became anything at all, wedged between larger battles that had better cameras and larger armies attached to their names. It took decades for recognition to catch up with the debt. On July 6, 1986, 42 years after the battle, a ceremony was held amid the ruins of the 12th century church. 11 villagers were awarded the United States Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service. 6 of the 11 received it posthumously, medals pinned, in effect, to memory rather than to the living. Among the 11 honored that day were people whose names had already earned a place in this account, proof that the record, however delayed, eventually caught up with specific names instead of vague gratitude. The record survives today mostly because the villagers of Graignes kept it alive themselves, in family stories passed at kitchen tables, in a handful of veterans who kept returning, in a plaque, in a rebuilt church that still stands where the old one burned. Official military histories mention Graignes, when they mention it at all, in a paragraph. The people who were actually there gave it a lifetime. Decades later, a small piece of that memory reached a wider audience by an unlikely route, a graphic novel, published under the title 6 Days, telling what its own subtitle called D-Day's Lost Chapter. It took until the 21st century for that description to feel accurate to most readers. For nearly 2 generations before that, Graignes was a name known mainly to the people who had buried their dead there. Odette Rigault said she and her sister lived only to save those men, and wondered what would become of them. She got her answer, eventually. Most of them lived, because she and a handful of neighbors decided that a stranger falling out of the sky into their marsh was still, somehow, their responsibility. That is the whole of it, in the end. Not a triumph, not a legend polished smooth by retelling. A debt, incurred in a swamp by accident, and paid twice over, once in blood, by men who would not run, and once in silence, by villagers who would not talk. Some debts get written into the history books. This one was mostly written into a churchyard and into the memory of the few who refused to let it be forgotten.